Hello, it's so great to see everyone here tonight. My name is Anna Lee, and I'm the photography curator for special collections here at Stanford Libraries. Thank you all for joining us this evening to celebrate 36 Views of the Moon, Ala Ebtekar's new project with Radius Books. Our event tonight will begin with an artist talk, followed by a selection of readings by Ala of source texts from 36 Views of the Moon. Afterwards, each of the book's contributors will offer their own critical perspectives on Ala's work. These presentations will be followed by a panel discussion between the contributors and then an opportunity for questions from all of you in the audience. Our speakers and panelists tonight are Alexander Nemerov, noted writer and professor in art history here at Stanford, Ladan Akbarnia, curator of South Asian and Islamic art at the San Diego Museum of Art, and writer and photo historian Kim Beil, associate director of ITALIC, the ITALIC interdisciplinary arts program at Stanford. Kim will also be moderating the panel discussion tonight. Ala Ebtekar has situated his practice as a leveling and collapsing of time and space. His work frequently orchestrates various orbits and cadences of time, bringing forth sculptural and photographic possibilities of the universe and time observing humanity. Exploring time, exposure, and light as both medium and metaphor, he uses sunlight, moonlight, and starlight to create durational works, sometimes taking an entire night to expose, which he views as collaborations with the sun, moon, and stars. That's beautiful. Ebtekar, throughout his practice, has employed the tactile traditions and properties of bookmaking, page and illumination in bound manuscripts, and classical training in Iranian coffeehouse painting. His alchemy of combining these legacies weaves into his commitment and work alongside enduring centuries of reclaimed text and image archives, poetry, and translation. His work has been widely exhibited across the globe at institutions such as the British Museum, the Xinjiang Biennial, the California Biennial, the Moriah Art Center in Sharjah, the Honolulu Museum of Art, and the Brooklyn Museum. His works are held in leading public and private collections, including the Whitney Museum of American Art, the British Museum, the De Young Fine Arts Museum, Microsoft Art Collection, Devi Art Foundation in India, and the Berkeley Art Museum, among others. Ala is a Bay Area native, which many of you know, and he has spent years living and learning and working with so many of the communities represented here in this room tonight. Ebtekar is a graduate of the San Francisco Art Institute and Stanford University, where he has taught since 2009. He is also the 2025 King Artist in Residence at Arian Press. Yep. Before we get started, I'd like to extend a special thanks to Amanda Minami for bringing this event to Stanford Libraries and giving us the opportunity to gather this evening. Through Amanda's Minami Book Grant for Asian American Visual Arts at Radius Books, she has supported the production of superb first monographs for some of the most exciting photographers working today. Radius, in turn, donates copies of each of its books to libraries, schools, and community organizations across all 50 states. The positive ripple effect of this kind of collaborative, mission-driven work cannot be overstated. Now, please join me in welcoming the first speaker, who's also our cause for celebration this evening, Ala Ebtekar.
So generous. Thank you so much. You know, I first have to just thank the whole team here, Anna, Sonia. You know, they've all done such a wonderful job with so much care in putting this, this event together. So I'm grateful, and a special thanks to Amanda, who can't be here, but kind of helped us do this and worked both behind the scenes and just getting us all here together. So thank you, Amanda. And most importantly, our three wonderful, brilliant panelists that I'm actually really looking forward to just sitting down with and having a conversation with. But, they early on, they took time with this work, they considered this work, and they each brought a very unique take on this work. So I'm forever grateful for that. So thank you for that, and thank you for being here. And I think just so I can kind of give the full picture of how this project, this book came along. This project, at its core, is an artwork that started about 8 or 9 years ago. So 36 Views of the Moon is a collection of night exposures that are left from dusk till dawn and exposed by moonlight on book pages that have referenced the moon and night sky for the past 10 centuries. So there's texts from the 9th century, 10th century, all the way to contemporary. And there's a lot of poetry as well, and we'll talk a little bit about that. I'm very much just interested in archives and libraries, but also these kind of photographic glass plate negatives, which I was looking into at the James Lick Observatory, very close by to here, and came across a small glass plate, and it was an image of the moon, and there was just something about that kind of prompted me to kind of look more into it. Sorry, I don't know what's going on. The cue, the work takes its cue essentially from this poem by Omar Khayyam, the 11th century polymath. And it's a quite simple poem: drink wine, look at the moon, and think of all the civilizations the moon is seen passing by. But there's something quite profound and about this. We oftentimes, in wonder and glory, kind of look up at the moon. But how often do we ask, what are we like under this gaze? So essentially, this work was birthed by a combination of this text being a prompt and the small negative that I showed was a glass plate negative, size of a book page, that was then enlarged. We digitized it, enlarged it, and we made it into essentially negatives that would be put on book pages, and that would be exposed to moonlight. And that exposure to the moonlight is what births the work. So just so it's clear, there's a photographic solution that is brushed on each page. And then I let it kind of sit under the moonlight. Sometimes you have to move with it because the moon moves, right, in the course of the night. And I've been, in thinking about specific texts that each of these books, each kind of these kind of references to the moon that have kind of, some of them are texts that have been with me for a long time, and some of them essentially appeared during this exploration, or they were found. The variation in color or tone is due to two things. One is that you can never repeat an evening, right? So every evening is unique. So that the light, the temperature, all those things affect it. But also seen in these kind of details is that each paper is from an actual book page. So you also have the different weights and tones of each paper that have kind of come together to create this this work. So here we are, 36 Views of the Moon. It started as a work that was produced under the moonlight of each season. So there's 4 unique works, each one working with the moonlight of a season, essentially. And it has a unique bibliography. So each work has a unique bibliography. And at some point, this idea, and I think it was /idea/opportunity, kind of came together to put this back in a book format. And I just thought it made a lot of sense. So that's what we're looking at. So thanks for being here to celebrate this occasion. I think I'm going to keep it short, but I think I don't usually do this, but I'm going to do some readings from this book and this work, and then we'll continue on with all our other great speakers. I was looking at another Emerson text that had referenced the moon, but this was just too right. So this made it. And it seems fitting to start with this as we are in a library. So in a library, we are surrounded by many hundreds of dear friends, but they are imprisoned by an enchanter in these papers and leather boxes. And though they know us and have been waiting 2, 10, or 20 centuries for us, some of them, and are eager to give us a sign and unbosom themselves, it is the law of their limbo that they must not speak until spoken to. Very early on, I think this was in 2018 that I had this this work, and I sent that to Alex because him and I have had this long conversation around Emerson that spans several years. And it's a poem by Lawrence Ferlinghetti, and there's 2 here. And the other one made it in because I have this connection with the redwood tree. I talk about this a lot, kind of a formative experience as a child, being here for locals to Muir Woods, just up here in Marin, with my mom, and kind of standing in front of a slice of a redwood tree. And as you know, there's some of the ones that they have, there's like, they label history rings, the history rings, and there's different moments in 1492 to 1942. But I remember as a young child just kind of brushing my hands across these rings and thinking, where am I in the eye of this tree? Am I just a kind of splinter, a day? Am I even significant? And I think coming across that Khayyam quote, that, drink wine, look at the moon, imagine, I think that's kind of the same thing. I think I was struck by the same, it's kind of saying the same thing. And then I thought about it, I think, in some ways, my work is kind of aimed to kind of create that experience for others in the last few decades. So a hole in a redwood tree through which we see the wrap of time and history, as through 3,000 rings the light sings. Ah, there's the moon circling the earth, like a halo ahead, a cynosure of celestial forces. Ah yes, the moon at night, indeed might somehow be on such a flight, reflecting as it does the light of great God's sun, and we down here blind in our courses still denying it when day is done. Ursula K. Le Guin, from her Dancing at the Edge of the World, writes, the lights of Cortez fade under the mountains, under gray-haired rain clouds, and to the left, a full moon rides faint in veils of rose and blue over the long mountain called the Sleeping Ute. Mahmoud Darwish writes, there are mourning scarves for poets, A row of marble statues will lift our voice, and an urn to keep the dust of time away from our souls. Roses for us and against us. You have your glory, we have ours. Of our home we see only the unseen, our mystery. Glory be to the moon, we journey towards a home. Maybe we'll land on the moon. Through the kitchen, moonlight, alone. Tanita Santoka. An excerpt from Harvest Moon, The Mockingbird Sings in the Night by Mary Oliver. The sky seems stretched like an old black cloth. Behind it, all the celestial fire we ever dreamed of. And the moon steps lower, quietly changing her luminous mass, brushing everything as she passes with her slow hands and soft lips. Earth of the departed sunset, earth of the mountains misty topped, earth of the vitreous pour of the full moon just tinged with blue. This is from Morrison's Beloved. Listening to the doves in Alfred, Georgia, and having neither the right nor the permission to enjoy it, because in that place, mist, doves, sunlight, copper, dirt, moon, everything belonged to the men who had the guns. Little men, some of them big men too, each one of whom he could snap like a twig if he wanted to. Men who knew their manhood lay in their guns and were not even embarrassed by the knowledge that without gunshot Fox would laugh at them. And these men who made even Vixen laugh could, if you let them, stop you from hearing doves or loving moonlight. So you protected yourself and loved small. Picked the tiniest stars out of the sky to own. Lay down with head twisted in order to see the loved one over the rim of the trench before you slept. Stole shy glances at her between the trees at chain up. Grass blades, salamanders, spiders, woodpeckers, beetles, a kingdom of ants. Anything bigger wouldn't do. A woman, a child, a brother, a big love like that would split you wide open in Alfred, Georgia. He knew exactly what she meant, to get to a place where you could love anything you chose, not to need permission for desire. Well, now that was freedom. Hafez writes, the small man builds cages for everyone he knows, while the sage who has to duck his head when the moon is low keeps dropping keys all night long for the beautiful, rowdy prisoners. This is perhaps the oldest of the texts. This is 9th century Rudaki. The text is the oldest of this set, as well as this image is printed, a moonlight exposure print on a lithograph printed book of Rudaki from the 1800s. It's very dear to me, and it was given to me as a gift. And I have to give you a little bit of context for this. So in the 10th century, Nasir Ahmad II, who was the Samanid Emir, who ruled over northeastern Persia from his capital Bukhara, which is present-day Uzbekistan, had a habit of spending the spring and summer in Herat, which is contemporary Afghanistan, away from the heat and the dust. So it's kind of like the spring-summer villa, if you will. And one year, he was so charmed by the climate and the beauty of Herat that he failed to return to Bukhara, as expected. And so months passed, and people got nervous. People in the city wondered, why isn't the Emir coming back? Something must be wrong. So there was kind of this panic that was kind of brewing. Everyone tried to bring the Emir back, but no one was successful. Knowing how deeply the Emir revered the poet Rudaki, who was the court poet, whose words he held in high esteem as well, and The vizier was also, he served as the commander of the army. So the vizier knew this relationship between the court poet Rudaki and the emir. So he approached Rudaki in hopes of persuading the poet Rudaki to get the king to come back home. People are getting worried. Rudaki was considered, an excellent musician as well as a poet. And so he traveled to Herat, where the emir was, and there in his presence, Rudaki plucked his harp and recited this poem. Juya Mulyan scent drifts my way, as do memories of a kind friend. Just a little bit of, Juya Mulyan is a river, and it holds both geographic and kind of poetic significance in Persian literature. But the word Ju also means canal, and it refers to a stream near Bukhara, and then Mulyan is this kind of garden, this kind of area that was near this canal. And he's talking about the scent of it. So he opens up with just the scent of this space drifts my way. The Amui, which is the Oxus River, is hard to cross, but its stones feel silken soft beneath our feet. Thrilled to see a friend, the waves leap halfway up our horses' flanks. O Bukhara, be happy, live long. The cheerful emir is returning to you. The emir is the moon, Bukhara the sky. The moon is returning to the sky. The emir is the cypress, Bukhara the garden. The cypress is returning to the garden. Now, according to the story, again, that's a story, a little bit, things might be exaggerated, but upon hearing the last line of the poem, the emir became so homesick for Bukhara that he mounted on his horse without shoes and galloped back home. I love that. I love the fact that, I love it for many reasons. One of the most remarkable aspects of this is that this poem story can be found as a preface or an introduction to a lot of books on how to write poetry. So if you're interested in taking up poetry in the Persian language, you might find this story in the beginning. Why is that interesting? I think, as an artist, I feel like we're always in defense or defending the arts as a catalyst for change, or what can art do? I always get these questions, do you think your art can do this, or can art do this? And I think the discourse here is so different. The discourse is so different. It's not about can it, but it's setting up this individual who's about to embark on a journey to become a poet, saying, this is its power. This is what it's capable of. What will you do with it? Right? It's a very different discourse. And I've been inspired by that. And I think it's just the fact that all the muscle and resources can't get the emir to budge, but here a few lines of poetry recited with a harp gets him to kind of run back, run. So I'll end on this last text, which is 12th century Attar. You are imprisoned in your filthy well, a dark and noisome, unremitting hell. Rise from this well, as Joseph did, and gain the throne of Egypt's fabulous domain, where you and Joseph will together reign. Dear pigeon, welcome. With what joy you yearn to fly away, how sadly you return. Now, this is a story that I've kind of has been in my, been with me for, at least 2 decades. But it's a story, and I'll try to summarize it very quickly, about a kind of a difficult, dark time. And thousands of birds essentially come together to embark on a journey because they know that out in the 7th Valley, there is a bird by the name of Seymour, the phoenix of the East, that will restore justice and bring light. But they know they have to embark on that journey. So they come together to kind of do that. Now, this is also metaphor. You can see this as a personal journey that one has to go through. But I'll read the rest. And the heart is wrung with grief. You share the jail that Jonah knew, the belly of a whale. The self has swallowed you for its delight. How long will you endure its mindless spite? Cut off its head, seek out the moon, and fly beyond the utmost limits of the sky. Escape this monster and become the friend of Jonah in that ocean without end. Welcome, sweet turtle dove, and softly coo until the heavens scatter jewels on you. As they embark on this journey and they go from valley to valley, some of them get scattered, some of them stay back. But once they get to that seventh valley, these birds look all around. And again, there were thousands of them as they started this journey. And they don't see the Seymour. They don't see the bird. It's supposed to be on Mount Goff, and they see the mountain. They don't see a bird. And they look down, and they see a lake there. And they see the reflection of themselves. And what is left of those thousands of birds are 30 birds. And the Persian language, Seymour, deconstructed, Si means 30, Mor means bird. So what is left is 30 birds. What is left is Seymour and that reflection. So this was also just to get a glimpse of kind of the wider practice for those not familiar with my work. This also became the conceptual framework for my last solo exhibition, which imagined the sky of these 7 valleys. And this is a combination of night exposures, prints, and as well as sun exposures, and of course painting. That is has been with me since I've been a child. Thank you.
It is very difficult to follow you, and yet also incredibly inspiring. It's just a joy to be in your presence, and I'm
Thank you.
so just amazed to look back and realize that we've known each other for 10 years, but it also feels like centuries that you bring so much more into every one of these stories. So thank you for having me here today. And so I'm looking back at this time that we've known each other, a decade, which really kind of feels like an epic in Stanford time. 2.5 generations of students have graduated in that time. Some buildings have been built and others have been demolished. We've had 3 university presidents and developed countless new acronyms. We've spent more than a year of that teaching on Zoom, which gathered students from all around the planet into a singular non-space that was telescoped onto a laptop screen. But in the timescales that Ala deals with, 10 years might as well be a molecule of space dust. It's minuscule, but it also contains the foundation for life. When we first met, I remember admiring your collection of books, these marvelous things that you pulled out from these hidden shelves in your studio. They were, I think, only just beginning to become part of your artwork at that time. And later, our paths kind of looped like comets, and they intersected again. I knew about Ala's work with cyanotype, but it was the material of this installation at the Asian Art Museum that drew me in again. For that project, he'd worked with potters in Fresno, California, to make tiles from local clay. He printed images of the cosmos on those clay tiles using the light of the moon and the stars. I can best describe the practice with my hands in that he was kind of bringing the light and the time of the heavens down to earth. And at that time, I was also just beginning research for a book project on climate proxies, or the way that natural materials like wood and clay hold ancient histories within them. So I invited Ala to join me on a search for some of that deep time history. And in the spirit of Ala's own practice, I'm going to tell you the story of that search. So we walked down the hill from my house to find a creek that meanders through recent geological past. It cuts through landslides and tree roots, and then it rips deep into history. A couple miles downstream, it flows into Searsville Reservoir at Jasper Ridge, which is Stanford's biological preserve. Samples taken from the Jasper Ridge and Searsville lake bed provide detailed evidence of human activity since the creek was dammed. Just as a Bureau of Standards holds samples that confirm our weights and measures, core samples are used by geologists to standardize the description of how Earth's strata or layers correspond with geological time. Against this yardstick, we can measure the global changes that many now call the Anthropocene, the first period in which Earth's geophysical systems have been fundamentally altered by humans. So on a sunny fall morning in 2023, Ala, two other colleagues, and I gathered at my house and followed a almost path down this very steep hillside to Corte Madera Creek. Sound fell away as the deep walls of the San Andreas Rift Valley insulated us from the above-ground world, and we were searching for clay. The three of us followed Hideo Mabuchi, who is a physicist here at Stanford, and who many of you might also know as a ceramicist. Hideo told us that we were looking for red or orange deposits suitable for earthenware, a low-heat firing process used by humans for tens of thousands of years to make pottery. Although all clay is natural, the material that one finds in the landscape is unprocessed and unaugmented, and ceramicists call this wild clay. The youngest member of our group, Meher Kumar, recently graduated from Stanford with a degree in environmental science. Like Hideo, when Meher's not at her microscope in the lab at Hopkins Marine Station, she's throwing clay at a potter's wheel. So the four of us reached the water, and we followed the dugout shape of the creek until we were eye level with the exposed roots of trees. It was cool and quiet, and I crouched down at the water's edge, kind of prodding the spongy creek bed with my finger while Ala told us a story, an ancient story. The 11th century Persian scholar Al-Ghazali described a contest at the court of Alexander the Great. Ala is careful in the story to point out that depending on the nationality of the person telling the story, the allegiances may change. But in the version that I heard this day, the competition features Chinese and Persian artists. They worked on either side of a room divided by a curtain for 6 months. The Persian artists bring their colorful paints and brushes, and the Chinese painters brought no pigments at all. When Alexander goes to judge the paintings, the Persian art is alive with all the colors of the rainbow and detailed images of life under the sun, moon, and stars. On the other side of the room, at first there is nothing. Then the curtain is raised, and suddenly the blank wall is resplendent with color. The Chinese artists had painstakingly polished the wall until it reflected all the colors of the world. When Ala finished telling the story, we all turned to Hideo. He was rolling a small ochre-colored ball in his hands. He had found clay. He pointed us out to the architecture of the tree roots, which had protected these little pockets of clay. And as I dug with one hand, I felt at first the soft grains were crumbling between my fingers, but then you dip it into the water of the creek and you kind of squeeze the water out. And then as you roll it between your palms, the soil can form its own little planet, a sphere. So standing in the creek, the blue sky waving beneath our feet, suddenly I was making a world. As in Al-Ghazali's story, two things come together to make this most elemental art, earth and sky mirrored in water. Later, we gathered on my porch in the hot sun with the mud washed off our hands and two little clay amulets sitting before us. And I asked my friends about their experience of natural materials. Why were they drawn to clay? And Ala told us that his art is meant to prompt a paradigm shift. And he shrugged a little bit when he said this, thinking, maybe it's a grandiose term, but then he very quickly regained himself. And he said, it's actually quite simple. It's present in small gestures, from using sunlight to print images of the stars, or moonlight to print images of the moon, and then printing these in turn on local clay or on books, or etching images of the sun into reflective metal, as he's been doing lately. All of Ala's art and storytelling are bringing these vast timescales together in elemental ways. At first, I have to admit, I was skeptical of the possibility of something so dramatic as a paradigm shift, no matter how much I really wanted to believe in it. But as the sun slid across the sky and our conversation followed its own course that afternoon, I started to hear something similar from the scientists, Hideo and Meher also. Art allows them both to get at something that their scientific practice discounts or avoids. a deeply embodied knowledge of natural materials and our human experience of them. As Maher says, in science, we can get really caught up with knowing about a thing, but that does not equate to knowing a thing. She described going out on the ocean to study whales. The researchers may take highly detailed measurements of the creature's biological systems, but she says something different happens when she sees the animal struggling at the side of the boat as the team affixes radio tags and takes blood samples. There's a kind of knowing that science isn't so good at explaining or even recognizing. Maher tells us that she has an affinity for the journals and logbooks of old-fashioned science, which didn't separate the experience of the observer from the observed so thoroughly. This Omar Khayyam epigraph that inaugurates Ala's project captures that experience elegantly for me. Khayyam instructs his readers to drink wine and look at the moon and think of all the civilizations the moon has seen passing by. At the edge of the creek, we may feel caught between two realms, between land and water, between earth and sky, but looking down at the sky reflected in the water at our feet, or looking at Ala's photographs that do the same thing with ancient light, we can for a minute imagine that we are not only observers of the world, but that we are also observed by it. Thanks.
Thank you so much for inviting me here today, Anna. Sonia, thank you as well. And Ala, most of all, I'm really grateful to you. We've been talking about trying to get together and do something and have a conversation. And what better way to do it to also be here with you, Kim, and Alex. So I feel really honored to be a part of such a brilliant group of people. And to have this opportunity to look at this work and Ala's work in general. My way of knowing Ala was first through Leila Diba, who's a very prominent scholar of modern and early contemporary art of Iran. And then Ala made maybe the best decision of his life to marry someone who's like family to me. So I'm really happy that in some ways, I've gotten to know you a bit before. I knew you a bit before, and then a lot more after, with my also moving from the UK to San Diego and having this opportunity to work closely with Ala, and I'll get to that in a moment. So I'm going to talk about my way of approaching my relationship with 36 Views of the Moon, and also how it kind of launched another branch in Ala's trajectory in the way I see it, and that's through the idea of the concept of wonder. So I'm going to be talking about from 36 Views of the Moon to a commission he did for the San Diego Museum of Art in 2024 called 1,000 Years of Light. So first of all, coming back to the piece itself, which you can see on the screen, one of the ways I was very, very much immersed in doing work on an exhibition called Wonders of Creation, Art, Science, and Innovation in the Islamic World. And I wanted Ala to be a part of this work because the exhibition itself is inspired by a book, a cosmography, written by a 13th century Islamic judge and professor named Ghazvini, who was actually came from a family of Arab immigrants, but really was from Ghazvin. He'd lived there, his family lived there for years. And in the 13th century, he survived 2 waves of Mongol invasions. And then in the wake of this tumultuous time, he fled the first wave, and then ended up in what's now Iraq, and there he wrote the cosmography after the second wave, when he was now a prominent scholar, and he wasn't, he had sort of power in his hands, and he took all the knowledge that he had in the world at that time, and he wrote the world into a book. And the reason why I'm starting with that is, and Ala teased me as well when I wrote my contribution to this book, that I see everything through Ghazvini. And that's because Ghazvini, in a sense, if you think about the cosmography, it's a description of the world. It's a description of the world from the heavens to the earth and everything in between. And that's what Ghazvini brings in the 13th century. It's his way of preserving information so that it won't be lost. And he says that at the beginning of the book. But it's also a way to bring solace and comfort to those who've survived such a tragic time, a tumultuous time, not so different than what we're going through today. And so what do you do? How do you find hope and how do you move forward? And you do that through wonder. And so he asks us at the beginning of this book to approach the world through the lens of wonder, which for him ultimately is about appreciating everything that's God's creation, but anyone with any faith or any belief can bring to it their own perspective. And so he talks about the moon. He gives this description, and he goes in order after he tells us to look at the world through wonder. And I feel like that's, in a way, the approach that Ala takes to his practice, and does it so naturally that for me, it was just a way of looking at it and saying, oh my goodness, Ghazvini would be so proud today. And so I start with a quote from Ghazvini, where he talks about the moon. Then look at the body of the moon and see how it acquires light from the sun to take its place at night. Then look at its waxing and waning. Then look at eclipses of the sun and moon. Among the marvels, or the wonders, are the black spots on the body of the moon, for which no satisfactory explanation has ever been heard. And this is at the crux of approaching the world, that you look at something and you see it once, and then you see it through the eyes of a child, maybe, and you see it again, and you pause. And when you listen to Ala speak, as you have now, but when he's sitting down, too, I'll be sitting here going, blah, 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 and I'm just so inspired by everything he says, and he'll just stop and say, it's when this, and he goes into the detail, and he's not afraid of that pause, and he's not afraid of asking the questions, and it's asking the questions that leads to seeking the answers, and it's in seeking the answers that for Ghazvini, you become closer to God. And he even says, wonder itself, it's about that very thing that perplexes us, that we can't understand the cause or impact of. And so one might look at Ala, and think that, he's kind of linked to Ghazvini in this chain, or silsila, as, this from master to pupil. And he also, in his own work, has created a chain that I see with the work that has come after 36 Views of the Moon. And in fact, everything about what he does, his work is so multi-layered that you see, we look at his practice, look at the cyanotype process. I'm not going to go into the technicalities of this. I've spent a lot of time trying to understand it as part of my way of really engaging with the work. And we can come to that in the Q&A. But what it does, even a work like you see on this screen, which we borrowed at the San Diego Museum of Art, which is kind of the next step toward deciding on the commission that he did, was looking at him introducing me to his practice, working with moonlight, working with these layers, learning these processes, not being afraid to work with different media. And then on top of it, why don't we put some 14th century Chinese-inspired Mongol clouds that people who studied the Ilkhanid period and art history or history will get really excited about, like me. And children might say, I could do that, as one of my children did when they saw this work. But of course, now they want to know if he's good at drawing dragons. And then all the layering that goes into it, so the bibliographies. And every time I think about 36 Views of the Moon and other works of Ala's, I think something new, and I learn something new, and I'm never tired of it. So today, my question is, the bibliographies, how did you decide who was going to be? I'm very much love that he doesn't just bring in Iranian scholars, Muslim scholars, Islamic scholars, Arab scholars, but also American scholars, Black scholars, people who are part of his community and the world that he lives in as an Iranian American. And that is the quintessential concept of an American artist today. You have all those layers and you bring them to it. So now I want to know, how did you decide which went to which season? And then from there, and also the idea of Ala as a collector, the idea that he collects images, words, and I've said this in the book too, the spaces in between, experiences, memories. That's kind of what Ghazvini was doing as well, collecting all of these things and then presenting them in this beautiful way where the language was as incredible as actually all of the material that he was presenting to us. And Ala does that with this poetry and lyricism that transcends the actual technicality and the materiality of his work. And that is another layer that I really appreciate. And so here we just sort of go into the technicalities of this work, actually going back one. I see 36 views of the moon as setting the precedent for 1,000 years of light, which is what you see now. Sort of ending with this work because it is the commission that Ala did for the exhibition, supported by the 2 federal grants, and some of which we're not getting the rest of, but just to show you how important those grants are, that the NEH and NEA helped support bringing this to fruition. And then Ala was very intent on having dialogues about this, understanding it, really engaging with the work. And then he decided to do this project really is about the exposure to moonlight and etching, layers of etching. But then when you look closely, and this is the whole idea of approaching through wonder, if you look from far away, you see this hot, blazing, flaming, blazing sun. But as you go closer, you'll see there's text. There are 15 copper plates, and each of them is etched with a page from a source that says something about the sun or light over 1,000 years, and the 1,000 coming with the final image that's over the entire thing that was taken in March by the Solar Orbiter, a picture, an image of the moon that you accessed at the Mount Wilson Observatory, right, outside LA. And here he is with technique. I'll skip that part, but look at the effect that has. We also had a globe from the 14th century that was out of Germany and God knows how many years out of Iran for the first time here orbiting the sun, the blazing sun. And to the side, and here you see the actual image. But it also brought new surprises, and your work constantly does this. The fact that one of these panels, actually a few of them, had these surprising liaisons with works in the exhibition. So an astrolabe made by Rouhani, you had a page from Rouhani's treatise there as well. So this is an astrolabe maker from Iran. And so I'm just pointing out where that was. And then you see a copy of Zenith also to the side. So the moon and the sun in balance. And I end with Khayyam, because you began with Khayyam as the kind of catalyst or inspiration for your work. And something that I sort of discovered as I was putting these images together. And that is basically that there's one page of poetry from Khayyam, Omar Khayyam. So he was a mathematician, astronomer. I mean, actually was known more for math and astronomy than he was for poetry in Iran until more recently. And I've translated the text on the left. I cannot conceal the sun with mud, nor can I speak of the secrets of time, which kind of really refers to the world, the universe. From the sea of contemplation, wisdom brought forth a pearl that I cannot pierce, which really refers to write about, out of fear. And these verses by one of Iran's greatest polymaths and poets, and the world's greatest polymaths and poets, capture this overwhelming sense of wonder that comes from seeking knowledge about the universe that we inhabit, a wonder that may yield pearls of wisdom that are so overwhelming that even the most erudite among us, like Khayyam, is too afraid to come out and try to articulate them. So we're in this constant attempt to do that. And again, that's something that I think you're always trying to do, to achieve, and do so beautifully. And knowledge, when you think about it as well, is in Arabic, and also in the word comes into Persian as well, ilm, means not just science, but knowledge, overarching knowledge. So art is not so different than science. Practice is not different than theory. And he really brings these all together. So if 36 Views of the Moon takes its cue from Khayyam, as you said, to produce a vignette of the windows to the moon, to shift our perspective to include the moon's gaze upon us, linking us to other objects over 1 billion years. In other words, to look and think bigger, wider, to contemplate with wonder. Then 1,000 years of light builds upon this trajectory and becomes another link in Ala's own silsila, or chain, of contemplation and artistic practice. Its many layers suggest that we too exist in the same universe across time, and reminds us of our respective roles within an interconnected cosmos. So that was my nugget from you today. And
Yes.
thanks for listening.
Thank you. Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for your work and for giving me a chance to write about it. And thanks to my two fellow speakers for their beautiful remarks. Yeah, I have two works by Ala at my house, and they bring pleasure to me every day. So I feel like that is an example of what he spoke about art has its intrinsic power, and it's up to us to do with it what we will. I'm just going to read my text, which is based on my piece in the book. For Ala Ebtekar, the moon looks down, sees what we are doing. True, it is not interested in most of our activities. In fact, activities are what it disregards. Instead, the moon sees our quiet, the moments of our repose, when our quiet is like its light. Then, like to like, we and the moon reflect. What the moon likes especially is to see us reading. Then it becomes the lamp of our words. It would be fair to say that seeing us thus, the moon exposes the words on the page, reading over our shoulder. Fair, except that exposure implies suddenness, whereas the moon's light is so low, so slow in the beam, so soft as in legends, that it takes a long time, a gradual eternity, so it seems, for the words to appear, thanks to that sunken eye, that gray socket of sun, our fast friend who never hurries. The moon is even the writer of the words we read. Every poet is a moon affixing their ray to the page, a seer of worlds that we then, by the light so thrown, see as words of our own. It's a connection like to like that's yet no possession, such as reading words made in moonlight, wisely cast down, the stuff of Rumi or Attar or Emerson or Morrison, the poet speaking from the night. So it is Ebtekar's poets who speak from a near sphere of eternity, not the so-called fixed universe of Aristotelian philosophers of old, the ones who held that there is truly nothing new under the sun, but rather here between the moon and the earth, this nearer sphere of eternity, this humbler zone, yet still so far above us, casts down its rays from those zones whose otherworldly glories are still our own. I burn, Robert Frost wrote, attesting to the star power of the poet's fixed remoteness. But the pages in Ebtekar's 36 views of the moon do not crackle in solar fire. They do not curl to embers of traveling sparks racing with lives of their own, spending themselves in last gasps of oxygen. The mind in creation may be a fading coal, as Shelley wrote, but Ebtekar ignores Shelley's sad view of inspiration as a force that dies as it flames to life. He sees instead the soft, steady light of page and eye, finds there an unburnt calm, a slow-folding wisdom, the long life of words and ourselves in moments of repose. Reading a book, a page of poetry, say, is equal parts truth and incomprehension. A page read in one light at one age, youth, for example, yields confusion and doubt. Read at another time, the same page glows in the humble light of a truth not its own, a gleam from above, tender and near, lighting that intimate sky, our inmost being, in a way that awakens near and far in a tenderness we believe, for once, is our own. And yet so comprehensive is the moon, so understanding, that when it glows patiently upon us night after night until one day we do understand, there on the silvery page, the words it has written there, it sprinkles on us the dust of our ignorance, our forgetting, as itself a measure of the cosmic truth vested in us. To say it plain, when Lucille Clifton writes that the moon is queen of everything, she means of tears and make-believe and fog. She means that when it looks down at us, a kindly goddess, maternally round, remarking the sum of our being, it illuminates the bafflement that infuses even our understanding. In Ebtekar's work, too, the word slow is a delicate shade, a Lucille light in just the right night, as it takes all evening for the moon to develop a picture of itself on a frail tissue of torn pages, so we too are slow to comprehend. This is our loveliness. For what quick-witted know-it-all is lovable, and who thinks that a line of poetry becomes clear forever and more, not the moon. Knowledge, says Emerson, and we've heard it here tonight, lies imprisoned in books, sealed in leather covers as if by an enchanter. It is we, therefore, who must initiate the conversation. The books will indeed not speak until spoken to. But even when we speak, when we crack the book's spine, letting the words suffuse, our very wisdom is steeped in the enchanter's spell who locked the box and threw away the key. The kind moon knows this as well. It washes us with the sleep of our waking, the dross of our forgetting, making our very insights mysterious, edged in ashen light. Creeds are not why we read. Moses coming down from Mount Horeb was only one type of us. He held the breaking news of truth, hot off the presses, the oldest newsboy there ever was. But there are other ways of getting the gospel from on high. Enduring truths, tablets, and commandments yield to tissue and rag, to vats of albumin strained and sifted and turned to pulp and page. The ones that Herman Melville wrote on and about, the frail sheets in which we divest such as we feel of command, of knowing everything, and see instead with the softness of a dream we cannot recall when we wake. At those moments, we are like Endymion, the sleeping shepherd boy, a guiding spirit of Ebtekar's work. Seen by Selene, the goddess of the moon, Endymion sleeps as the enamored goddess sends down her beams, caressing his body in the light of her love. If Titania in A Midsummer Night's Dream tells a fairy to pluck the wings from painted butterflies, to fan the moonbeams from his sleeping eyes, Selene sheds her full light, unfanned, direct and gleaming, onto the beautiful boy, letting him sleep in a radiant fantasy of the real. Call it a prolonged duration of bliss, of being read by the stars or developed by them, photographically developed, yes, but also developed as in matured, turned into a person whose youthful experiences, his most heavenly erotica, his moments, that is, of being read by the sky, highlighted from above, singled out, amount to a seduction he will always remember. And even as he grows old, even as he walks with ever infirm step, so the crush of the moon will be the light in which he basks. And if that crush is made of words, if finally we are given our cues, our scripts, told what is special in us by some remote force that loves us, then who are we to say that we too, like Endymion, do not become immortal in having been so beheld? And if it is all a game played by a goddess whose passions are real, but whose interests are elsewhere, not in our sphere, if that is, it is all a pious dream to think that we are seen by the moon and in those quiet moments held forever in some higher light, maybe it is no mean feat that the dream itself, the fantasy, is what sustains us. In waking, yes, we may behold nothing of what we felt. The very pages that drew us, that seemed lit for us alone, fade from memory as if overexposed, as if memory, long and dreary, were finally the medium of our vanishing, our losing touch, our forgetting. Yet why then do we still dream? in the light of day. Ebtekar is a dreamer, thank goodness. When he wakes, he remembers what he does not know. And if the moon has a mind of its own, if it is finally only interested in itself, its self-portrait, just that, then he, Allah, is glad to courier the orb's picture from one place to another, to be, as perhaps we all are, the bearer of a light not one's own. Thank you.
We have a little bit of time for discussion up here, and then we'll open it up for some questions. So thank you, everyone. And I'm reminded, immediately of what a great pleasure it is to be read to and to hear words spoken. It's fascinating that we're here in celebration of a book, which we, in today's culture, think of as a thing that you take home and that you read by yourself, and yet it is a large book that you can share with others. And so I'm wondering if each of our panelists could speak a little bit about that. What is it like to be read to? What does hearing stories mean to you? And I know that this has a place in Ala's childhood. You've told me about spending long nights awake and having others read to you. So maybe I can send that to you first, and then we'll come down the line.
I mean, sure, and I could kind of talk about this both from that childhood experience of just my mom would read, and sometimes there are stories that become not so read, but just kind of made up as she kind of went. She's a storyteller, and I can also talk about it as a father who sometimes sits in, kind of like listening to my wife read to my daughters, and I always think she reads so well, like so beautifully, and the stories are. Some of them are good, some of them are not. But I think the act of being, just hearing it and knowing that it's being listened to by these young people, I enjoy.
I think similarly, I have memories. Well, I have memories of being very young. So I was born in the U.S. and then we lived in Iran for a few years. But in that time, there was a 6-month period where my father had gone to do a fellowship in another state. And so my sister and I went to sleep listening to his voice, telling us stories that I still remember, and I wish we had those tapes. But he sort of brought that back by telling stories to my children, and they're called elephant stories. They feature elephants. And often these elephants are bringing in maybe struggles or challenges that perhaps some in the family have experienced that day or are going through. And there's always, there's a pattern, I think, beyond, almost subconsciously, it's almost not meant to be that way, but that they have. And then so I find that they engage you, and then for me also, after having children too, just having that storytelling time, but then watching my children's imaginations flourish because they're read to, because they're part of this. And also, as a curator, storytelling is that way that everyone gets an in. Almost anyone I've ever, anyone can relate to telling a story, being part of a story. And I feel like that's sort of the approach that I take. And I've got one over in that corner over there making drawings, and they have stories. Every one of those characters has a backstory, and they're part of a bigger story. And so I feel like it's the gift that keeps on giving. Thanks.
It's beautiful.
Your question, Kim, makes me think of just the relationship between all his work and conversing, which is maybe not what we usually think of when we think of photography. That's a very special thing. It's sort of, how to say it, it's part of your sweetness and your care and the intimacy of your work and the fragility of it, which I think is naturally connected, I think, to scenes of childhood reading and nurture, and the nurture of words and the nurture of poetry in particular as a particular kind of consecration of words and of the voice, which I agree is a thing in the world and doesn't need to explain itself or to be something other than it is in order to take a cue from the moon and enchant or try to enchant. So there's a natural relation between your work and books. And I would say with children's books, in a way, like a big storybook. You know, these terms that sound not nearly art-worldy enough are the ones that are most important, probably. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think there's also there's something about being surrounded by books. A library still brings me more peace and comfort, and I think maybe part of it is maybe surrounded by books I know, but also the huge unknown of all the books that what they could contain, and eventually maybe I'll go through some of these books. You know, this book is dedicated to my dad, who introduced me to the wonders of the library, really, like that experience of just going to many different libraries, Berkeley campus, but also elsewhere, in so many bookstores. And I don't mean once a week, I mean like every day. To the point that as a young child, I like memorized the architecture of these spaces. And so it's still to this day, being in those spaces, even if I don't know any of the books, brings me a certain level of peace.
I really respond to the smell of paper. You know, like, so if I get a new book, first thing that you do is just smell it, you know. So digital, you know, I've recently got Kindles for my children. I still don't know how to use them. I haven't even, because they read so much that if we travel, it's too difficult. But I also I didn't grow up with, you know, so my parents have different collections of books, but our incentive was if you bought a book, they always paid for half. If you bought anything else, you know, you use your allowance, use your own money to do it. So there's incentive in buying books, and I have a hard time resisting getting them for my children, even though there's a library that they can go to. So there's that, but there's also books that aren't available at the library. And I think you bring the book, and then I also think, what did it feel like to have the page out of the book, to bring that, you know, What does it feel like to take it out? And in some cases, it can be a very violent thing, and in other cases, it can be like a breaking down to build back up and to rebuild a memory or a layer or something else. So each of those, I appreciate each of those took decision and was done with such care. But I sort of feel like you've taken the book out of itself, and then you're creating new pages of a new book, new pages.
Ladan and I are communicating on another level. I had that question in my notes. You do not know that yet, but
I knew that. That's exactly what I wrote.
I wanted, and maybe this will be our last question, so we have time to open it up to everyone else, but I wanted to hear all of your feeling. What did you feel when you learned that Ala had received this gift, as you told us tonight, that is based on a 9th century manuscript, and it's a 19th century lithograph, which then became this work of art. So how does that feeling of time passing, or the feeling of the dismantling of the book and then becoming of something else, how does that speak to you?
Well, I think Ala was not dismantling like a 14th century manuscript, so that makes it a lot easier for me as somebody who looks after those. And in fact, I think he has tremendous reverence, which I know, we all see. So I think, lithograph is also, it's the printing press, it's the mass production. It's meant to be disseminated widely. It has so I almost think there is a rarity to old editions, but they are printed editions. And so I until tonight I was thinking, oh, well, there's dismantling here. But I don't see it that way necessarily. I actually find it a very reverent act.
Yeah, one of the two pieces my wife and I own by Ala is of pages of Emerson disarticulated, late 19th century. And there's a Persian pattern superimposed, I think inkjet printed over the 19th century pages, and there's a window pane in the middle, which I guess embodies a way of reading where you just focus on one thing. And I was just reading that page that happens to be at the center of our work today that is framed by the carpet-like pattern, and it's from Emerson's essay, Illusions. It's such a beautiful description of being in a cave in Kentucky and having a tour 6 miles underground, actually partly walking, partly rowing on these underground rivers through this place with its kind of chapel-like stalactites and fantastic roof patterns and shooting guns or playing music to hear the echo patterns. All of that just brought right there. And I think that it was a reverent act as opposed to a discomposing one that created that experience for me. And I have to say, it does it in one form or another every single day, that work. It's just fantastic. It's in our bedroom, and it's just a very prominent work in our house.
That's interesting. I just have to jump in to say this. You are describing something, it's called the shamse, that illumination that you see normally at the beginning of a manuscript. It's the illumination. And it signals the start, this beginning. And I feel like by taking that page, he's turned it into the beginning of something.
Yeah. It is the beginning of the essay. But yes.
Did you choose it for that? Or did you? Because I know that you've had other excerpts that you framed that way too.
Completely by chance. So it was these windows that kind of, there's this larger structure of, kind of gridding up these pages, but where this kind of shamse, this kind of really a window to the text, to the book, opens up. Complete chance.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Well, thank you all so much. I think there are probably microphones that are going to go around.
Well, thank you. I think if you zoom out, it actually all makes sense. There's so many things I can draw from, not just my childhood, but things that my parents have echoed into my life from their childhood, and my grandfather, who and my great uncle, who was a renowned poet. I think if you zoom out, in some ways, what I do makes a lot of sense. I can only see it from that perspective because I'm in it in some ways. But if I zoom out, there are everything has kind of got me here. Everything. It's funny. Alex talked a little bit about this moonlight, and I was thinking about that stillness. That is the place that I work best now, in that stillness. In fact, the second edition of 36 Views of the Moon, when I was doing the actual prints, probably around 2019, 2020, we had just had our first daughter, and there were these evenings that I was trying to give Mom a break, where I would go and kind of try to look after, the baby, and at the same time look over prints and these things that were happening at the same time in the stillness. There's something about these things happening at the same time, and even I think about the stillness of right now when I paint, it's early in the morning before the busyness, before everything kind of gets crazy, and then some people they ask me, oh, you grew up in Berkeley in the 80s, it's known for being berserkly. It's like the crazy place, and your parents were super young and they were activists. It must be a really crazy and chaotic. And I always say, actually I felt the most safe and at peace. There was a sense of purpose in their lives. And even though everyone was in their 20s, they were, it felt like a real community. And I actually thought about this recently, a little bit off subject, but with my daughter, I have an older daughter who's 6, and these moments of separation, even when she started kindergarten, that separation anxiety, and I was thinking back to when I was that age, and I remember in the 80s there were a lot of demonstrations that would kind of some of them would start at Embarcadero, and they would go down Market all the way to Civic Center, and you can imagine for a young kid that's really tiring, to walk that distance, right? So they would have these trucks that were almost like for, I don't know, like chicken coops or something, like it's a big pickup with wooden kind of railing. So, and kids were invited to go and, kind of ride this truck through Market Street with all the demonstrations happening. And it felt, there was no issues. I felt like I was very kind of loved. And in this kind of community, it's very kind of, not community in this kind of buzzword way of saying community, but as a genuine community where you felt safe. And with all that chaos, with, wars happening, and there was this genuine sense of peace and in my own life and stability, even though everything was unstable. So I don't know. I think if you zoom out, all these things have come into echo into the work, one way or the other. I can't single one thing out.
Thank you so much for this rich discussion of your work. I'm curious about your exposure process. If you had to choose nights that were cloudy, or you had to go somewhere remote so that you would avoid light pollution.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, I try to choose sites or find an area that light pollution isn't an issue. A lot of the, some of the street lights are actually, they're not all UV, so that's actually not an issue. But the process happens in a dark room. So I brush these pages, and you can see there's you can see the kind of the hand involved, right? There's, I know there's different ways of doing it. Ben is here, and but the way I do it is I'll brush these pages and let them dry, and then I'll put a negative over them and bring them out and let them essentially print under that moonlight. And there's a lot of I think what also Ladan was mentioning about these books. There's certainly that tension, especially for books that I'm really, I really want this. It is an act of vandalism, but to honor in some ways. It's like honoring. So there's definitely a care there, and I think that's why that connection I was talking about. Overseeing this baby and overseeing this print. So you have to kind of follow it through the night. The moon shifts and where it is in the sky, so you kind of move with it. And
kind of like raising a child.
That was hard, yeah.
That was hard.
But yeah, so I think there's an art to it. And I think when I initially started this process, there was this goal of this perfect image, and later that shifted to, what I thought was perfect is actually, some of those things that, they're just recordings in some ways of a night. And there's a lot of imperfection if you can look at it from different perspectives. But I've really embraced that. And recently with Ariane Press in San Francisco, we actually did a print on the rooftop in Fort Mason of the full lunar eclipse. And that was all kinds of issues. It started to rain, and it got, but there were some interesting things that came out of that. And I think, you may look at it and be like, well, I don't see this, that negative printed, but I still see it as a recording of an evening, of a moment of time passing. And even that carries something for me now, so.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about the process across your work in 2007, when he was layering different figures, drawings, one on top of another. And now, looking at these works, I see, again, layering. You cannot see collage work or layers together, but I feel like that's sort of a technique that you use often in your different bodies of work. You use different techniques and different processes, but I see quite a lot of layering. So I'm wondering, do you think about trying a new technique and you pick up a new technique and the ideas come with it, or you just really want to express an idea and you think about the right technique for it? Because I can't put my finger on one single technique you used.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think if I were to summarize my medium is light and time. And so if you look at works that Alex was referencing, works on book pages to even the copper work, at the core is light and time. And so sometimes that manifests in different ways. When I think about the book, I think of, I initially started working with these old book pages that had all these notes and glosses from different contributors adding to the page, almost like a collective of voices through 100 years. And in some ways, it's quite similar to 36 Views of the Moon, if you think about it. So I think at first appearance, it might look like a departure, but I think at the core, it's still light and time. And there's this reference to ancient materials that Kim made, and when I think about working, think of the materials, I do think about many of them as like these ancient witnesses. So whether it's clay, that's had, it's taken millions of years to kind of form, or pages and authors that are centuries, maybe before mine, but it feels like it's a much older lifespan than mine. And so by kind of working with them, I almost feel like you're also asking them, or that material, what has that material seen? Who is it engaged with? What has happened on that land? What has happened on that? Part of the reason of working with California soil, the invisible, the labor on that land, all the different things that go into that material. So I think in some ways, at the core, it's in some ways the same, though.
One more question. Sorry, two more questions.
Thank you so much for that panel. This has been wonderful. I have a question following up on one of the panelists who mentioned the bibliography and the choice of the works that he did. When I first saw it in person, I kind of thought it was fun to look at, because at first I recognized the Persian poets and more Islamic poets, and then I saw more of like the Western ones, and I thought, that's like a fun game to see the surprising choices. You mentioned earlier that you had a library, and so maybe my broader question is, how did you choose what you wanted to include? Was it first you started with this sort of imagery of the moon and you remember things that you read before, or did you actively search out works that sort of have a theme that you're looking for?
Yeah, it's a combination. There's for example a book. It's actually Calvino's Invisible Cities that my high school comparative lit teacher gave to me when I was 11th grade. And she said, just read one page every evening. Don't read more. And I thought as an 11th grader, that's awesome. I don't have to read more. And later I realized, I see. This is a description of a city. It's supposed to you're supposed to let it marinate, it's supposed to sit with you. That book, that specific edition too, not just finding that, that specific edition that she handed to me, still in my library. It took 20-some years to make something with it as far as something, maybe an artwork. It's always echoed into my general but that made its way into one of the editions. And then there's another component which I genuinely find really a rich, process with this work is the sense of exploration. There's a true joy that comes to building a bibliography and going through materials, familiar ones, unfamiliar ones, new, So it's a combination, and then it's trusting your intuition.
I was just going to say that I think your work proves, especially as an art historian who constantly has to prove that art history is not just history with pictures or sculptures, that you really have so many layers. There are so many layers that go into it, and every time you take this and engage your work and the visual culture in general, you learn something new. So that even the bibliography then, it creates a life of its own, and they start having relationships that you may not have even noticed.
For sure.
I do that in curating too, like I noticed, and then that sort of starts a whole other chapter, you know.
Yeah, and I have to say, like, that's a great point, and I want it to be taken as almost an invitation. And part of the reason, before I knew this would become a book, was that every time this work was, was exhibited, I asked for an 8.5 by 11 copy of the bibliography as a takeaway, just a stack of it there, so that folks, if interested, could kind of take that with them and kind of look more into it. Actually, the summer edition is currently on view at the San Jose Museum of Art. So if anyone's interested, it's in their collection now on view.
Thank you so much for this presentation and the discussion. I was curious to learn more about your choice of copper as the material for 1,000 News Flights. I had loved your work on paper for so long, and I'm really curious about what led you to choose copper, how you think of metal as connected to your other materials like paper and clay, and then as you envision future directions, how do you see metal coming into your work?
That's a great question. I was thinking copper for such a long time, and it took so long to get to this. Ben knows because we went to he was talking about, I think it has to be a daguerreotype because I need copper, and he said, well, come over, we can do do a little session with you. Total failure, not what I was looking for. I knew I wanted to use copper and also sunlight, but I wanted to work with a material that stripped down at its core with no additive thing was and could reflect light and be a mirror. So, and it was really through you could think about all these practices as or mediums as alchemy, but through the polishing of it, it becomes a mirror. And it goes back to that story that Kim mentioned and this idea of a story of these two artist collectives, Chinese, Romans, kind of working in parallel, and one working towards this kind of additive, in an additive way. Layers of paint to depict mountains and waterfalls and sky. And the other collective of artists just cleaning the surface and polishing it to the point that it reflected the work of the other artists collective. So it was both this kind of, in some ways celebrating the other artist's work, at the same time getting to something through a different method. And I love materials that inherently have that potential. It's just within them. So if you just polish it, it'll reflect light and be a perfect mirror, Does that make sense? Yeah.
Thank you so much. I encourage everybody to save their questions and to ask them in person during the reception, which will begin in just a couple minutes. Thank you so much to the presenters for those amazing presentations, very diverse presentations and discussion. I was thinking as you were each talking that so much, as a student of history of photography and a curator now, so much of the rhetoric around photography is rooted in discussions about the sun, right? A kind of metaphor of the sun taken literally and printing itself on the page. And listening to these presentations that are based in moonlight, and thinking about moonlight, there's so much more of a discussion of the materiality of the book, of the photograph, of smelling paper, of really kind of these hard evocations of references that are coming up, as opposed to kind of more of a wondrous subjectivity about what the sun throws down onto the page. And it made me think, is this a path forward for a paradigm shift? Anyway, thank you so much to our presenters. Thanks to all of you for being here and for being such a wonderful audience. Please join us for a reception behind you, and please come up to meet Ala at the table. We'll be signing books and encourage the discussions between you personally. Thank you.